Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for staying with us up to this stage. And I am Nyandire Reinhart with the African Wildlife Economy Institute, where I serve as a research programs coordinator and at the same time a research fellow. Now, in addition to the previous presentations, I will be giving an overview around the sustainability in wildlife products value chain. Now, in the wake of the post-COVID pandemic period, especially with the green recovery, green economic recovery globally, and with the pandemic having exposed the vulnerabilities of the traditional financing mechanisms for the biodiversity conservation sector in developing countries, there has been an increasing interest in developing initiatives that promote the growth of biodiversity-based value chain approaches that utilize at a landscape level the local biodiversity and at the same time benefits or supports the local livelihoods of the communities that lives or bear the full cost of conservation. Now, in this case, how do we define a value chain? There has been wide-scale definitions of what a value chain is, but in this context, we look at it as a set of enterprises and stakeholders along the range of activities required to bring specific wildlife products from the initial input or production stage to the supply stage through various processes and stages into its final market or consumption destination. What makes the African wildlife economy's approach a bit unique from the other approaches is that ours is more a proper type of value chain engagement, which we mainly centrally position the local community, again, who bear the full cost of conservation to benefit from the operations of wildlife products value chain in Africa. Now, a value chain is a multi-layered system which is mainly composed of five key components or sectors. One is the economic functions, which again is all the way from the production to aggregation to storage, all the entire wildlife products value chain stages from the production all the way to the end consumers. Number two is the inputs, which is both financial and non-financial services. This includes includes the provision of inputs and financial and non-financial services that are essential for the economic viability of a specific wildlife product value chain. And there's also the value chain governance. The value chain governance consists mainly of business linkages, relationships between different key stakeholders, and power play or power distribution among different stakeholders, which includes the producers, buyers, processors. There's also the legal framework and regulatory institutions. And then the fourth one is the market. There's the market which is mainly characterized by the supply and demand dynamics and by varying degrees of competition at different levels. And then last but not least is the enabling conditions, which touches on the broader enabling environment, which includes the policy, political goodwill, etc., etc. Now, a lot has been said again around the verification schemes for wildlife products value chain. But in this case, I would look at it in a way that there are two key approaches or methodologies, or I would say umbrellas, to verify the sustainability in operations around wildlife products value chains. One is policy or integrated governance, as I briefly mentioned in my previous slide. And number two, that has been presented before, is the standards and certification schemes. I will not go into detail because a lot has been said about it and a lot will be said. But now these systems, I look at it from based on the previous presentation and different research and examples. They provide valuable mechanisms for delivering sustainable management of key economic, environmental, and social impacts. And these systems also deliver business benefits through better practices and efficiencies by mitigating reputational risk that arises from some of the pre-identified or identified impacts. Again, looking at these standard and certification mechanisms, they promote best practices that is related to not only just biodiversity or environmental issues, but they extend to social issues, land use, and production practices within a specific wildlife products value chain. And then finally, there are so many initiatives, as you've seen, obviously, that are focused on implementing sustainability verification approaches both within and outside the standard system to enhance the sustainability in operations of different wildlife products value chain, with a key and core objective of diversifying the financing mechanisms for the biodiversity and sustainable livelihood sector. Some of the core principles towards defining what a sustainable practice or towards promoting sustainable practice in wildlife products value chain includes part of which we're doing right now, the continual learning and adaptive management, recognizing that the wildlife value chain processes are dynamic and uncertain, and that adaptive processes are needed to respond to different or changing circumstances. There's no one size fits all approach in the operations of these value chains. An example, some methodologies or mechanisms between the eastern part of Africa and the southern part of Africa could be, in some cases, conflicting or running parallel to each other. Number two is the active stakeholder engagement. This should also take the cognizance of the fact that solutions are built mainly on shared negotiation processes, taking into consideration the different and sometimes again conflicting interests of the key and core stakeholders engaged in the whole value chain processes. Number three is the multifunctionality, which again touches on the landscape and the components having multiple uses and purposes which are derived and designed by the local landowners and indigenous communities in the region. There's also the multi-stakeholder engagement, an active engagement, which is linked to my previous, the second point above. Now, why is a standalone is, again, if you look at the whole value chain processes, there's a need for a proper cross-sector engagement and cross-border involvement of different key stakeholders of the key economic sectors in the region, looking at the legal sector, the business sector, the agricultural sector, the health sector, and the biodiversity conservation sector. And then there's also the clarification of rights and responsibilities of different, land use and land use rights in the region, which needs to be clarified and made clear in terms of what is accepted and what's not accepted. So the participatory and user-friendly monitoring systems are the stakeholders within this and sometimes conflicting interest. There's a need to facilitate a shared learning information and information needs that needs to be widely accessible to the different key and core stakeholders engaged or involved in the whole value chain functioning processes. There's also the need for resilient systems that can be increased through an active recognition of potential threats and existing vulnerabilities, or the functioning or operationalization of different wildlife products value chain. And then finally, there's also the strengthened stakeholder capacity. The complex and changing nature of landscape process, as have been mentioned by some of the previous presentation, requires competent and effective representation and institutions that are able to engage with all the issues raised during the processes. Part of it includes identifying potential capacity needs and looking for mechanisms or resources to identify to address these capacity needs. Now, as I mentioned previously, there's also the need for an integrated policy framework approach. With all these different interests and different stakeholders in the current discussions around addressing the siloed approaches to some of the diversifying the financing mechanisms, there's a need to intensify the proper management of wildlife products, and this again will bring in both the non-market and market values in different wildlife products, and especially along the value chains. Now, an example, looking at the gum arabic production in Sudan, the traditional governance systems has given Sudan some steps ahead of some of the competing countries such as Chad in their operations of the functioning of the gum arabic production all the way to the consumption value chain in the region. So in this case, there's that need for not just the current existing or modern policy or governance systems, but there's a need to borrow into the traditional systems or look or identify the or cultural connotation of values around this wildlife products value chain. This touches more, as I mentioned again, on both the market and non-market value and bringing on board the cultural and traditional forms of governance that, as an example, has given Sudan some advantage over their competing or other competing countries. One thing that is also important to note is that studies and reports have indicated that the private sector may not have much interest in investing in wildlife products value chain when land use rights are not clearly defined. The issue of land use right and wildlife products ownership or customary rights has been a major problem, especially in the African region, in terms of the proper functionality and benefit sharing from a functioning value chain system. And this is why most or some of the value chains around specific wildlife products collapses over time because of that the lack of proper definition of land use right or the customary right of the local who are the key stakeholders, local indigenous, local landowners and indigenous communities. What are some of the recommendations to enhance the sustainability in wildlife products value chain? Number one, there's a need for a programmatic approach to value chain development, which again brings on board different degree of preparedness from multi-stakeholder, cross-border, or in some cases, cross-sector involvement from the initial stages all the way to the production or consumption stage. Number two, there's need to promote more outreach or POPOA type of value chain mechanisms where the key beneficiary are the local communities at the local level. And this again will, aside from just diversifying the financing mechanisms, will provide the incentives for the local communities to look at biodiversity conservation as an economically alternative land use option. Because one of the major problems that we face is a loss of wildlife habitats due to lack of proper incentives for the local communities to get involved in biodiversity conservation. This is also a unique and very interesting approach on or recommendation on gender equity. There's a need for a gender-specific approach that takes into cognizance the gender aspects and in some cases, the gender imbalance within different communities and different regions in Africa, for instance. So there's a need for a proper gender equity or gender-sensitive strategies for a properly functioning wildlife products value chain engagement. And then finally, there's also the issue of the inclusive governance, which is more or less linked to the programmatic approach, where there's need for a multi-stakeholder engagement and creation of different platforms and interprofessional associations that provide small-scale producers and other value chain stakeholders within which information on prices and markets are being shared so that the local communities can know what are some of the actual prices that are existing in the market. And then a venue for dispute resolution in where there's a multi-stakeholder engagement, there's so many conflict of interest, which has to be addressed at an earlier stage. And then finally, a mechanism for voicing out or discussing policy and regulatory systems. So thank you so much, and I look forward to engaging with you further during the symposium. Have a good day.